In this second session, we look at the public in public theology. Faith that has become privatized, individualized, and pietized will have problems with the public in public theology. Back in the 1970s, a predecessor of mine in the Methodist Youth Department conducted a study week for a church. He asked people to read a biblical text along with a newspaper. Some people stormed out, complaining that they had come to church to hear about God and not to read the paper. What they were really saying was that church was about God and society and the world should be left outside. The logic of that was that God was not concerned or engaged with the world and that faith was otherworldly. And this was the 1970s, and Northern Ireland had fallen apart, and the bombings and shootings and killings were at their worst. The words public theology first appeared in 1974, and it was used to describe the theology of Reinhold Niebuhr, a leading American-German practitioner of Protestant ethics. It was not until the 1980s that public theology really began to develop as a disciplined form of thought and action. Niebuhr had a contemporary, John Courtney Murray, an American Catholic theologian and ethicist. Murray's big thought was that the 20th century issue was not church and state, but church and world. How should the church respond in relation to a society which is pluralist and secularized? Niebuhr was wrestling with the close interaction between religious insight, philosophical reflection, and social analysis. Niebuhr and Murray were doing public theology. In 1981, Chicago church historian Martin Marty wrote an influential book, The Public Church. The title became popular and the thinking developed. Public church came to be expressed in three ways. One, there is respect for the autonomy of other social institutions. Public church is not the hegemonic, dominant institution of Christendom, but respects the reality of secularization. Two, there is the acceptance of some responsibility for the well-being of the wider society. The public church cannot be sectarian, talking to and maintaining itself, or focused only on the spiritual well-being of its members. And three, there is commitment to work with other social institutions in shaping the common good of the society. The public church is ecumenical, engaged with the whole community of life, working with other Christians, people of other religions, and all people of goodwill. These are the characteristics or benchmarks for a public church or community of faith, located, as it always is, in the societal context. It can and has become a subculture, separate from or seeing itself as above society, with no responsibility for the society and its well-being. In Northern Ireland, there has always been a theology of separatism, keeping the faith community pure and separate from all forces of contamination. It was sectarian, but public church cannot be sectarian. Sometimes it was so caught up in its own identity and the purity of its identity, and had sufficient numbers that it didn't need or feel the need to relate to other traditions. But shrinking churches and levels of practice cannot afford today not to be public church. Well, you can, but it's a road to irrelevance and being obsolete. The faith community has a societal context. There is no separatism. Church is not a preservation society. It is always public in that its members are members of a wider public. Its plant is situated in the public square or the public street. All of life swirls around it: poverty, affluence, social and educational disadvantage or deprivation. There is bad housing, housing that is too expensive, poor amenities, inadequate health care, long-term chronic illnesses. There is unemployment, job uncertainties, chronic debt, racism, sectarianism, homophobia, crime, broken relationships, child abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence, levels of suicide. There are social, economic, and cultural inequalities, all-pervasive patriarchy in the church and around it. All of life in its beauty and brokenness, social and personal suffering, issues of life and issues of death. This is the societal context of the public church. There is no option but to read the newspaper, listen to and watch the news, engage in social analysis, and search for and be committed to a real strategy of church or faith engagement. This is not the public church seeking to dominate or control society. That was the pattern for too long. The wider public got tired of it and has rejected it. Strategies of public engagement are about partnership and collaboration for the greater well-being and flourishing of society and the human community. I once heard the Catholic Bishop of Brussels say that in the engagement of all the churches of Europe, together with the institutions of the European Parliament and Commission, they were not advocating for the church. They were advocating for the human. Public church is not engaged with society and the world for the church, but for the human and for the eco-community. In exploring what it means to be public church in the public square, the primary concern is not with the maintenance of power of the institution, but for human and eco-flourishing. In stressing and working for the model of public church, the major concern is not that we are in an age without faith or that the secular has taken over. It is a concern that we are in an age of faith without social meaning. The public church, rooted in its public and societal context, engaged with its public world, is a church or community of faith, whose faith, theology, symbols, and liturgy are all consciously weighted with social meaning. Here are two questions for interactive group discussion. Discuss the three characteristics of public church and draw out their implications for being public church in today's society and world. And then, what does it mean to advocate for the human and not for the church?